This is the final lightning lesson of this course I'm doing, the lead up to this course, Cheat at Search with Agents. I'm really excited about Agentic Search. You can see there's a discount code here, actually a discount code from the last session, but there will be one for this session as well. Agentic search is interesting to me because I sometimes I do a lot of work with, it seems like I end up doing a lot of work for companies that build search as for someone's job. And so I think like that's probably one of the places we'll talk about where agentic search is having such a big impact. It's like there is some workflow that an agent might be appropriate for like helping out with. And then I also think it's interesting from two other angles. One is continuing the sort of just LLM query understanding angle that I've had through this whole course that's going to be present. And then also some of the interesting stuff we could talk about with how much could we let agents do things like tuning search relevance or vibe coding a search stack? Like how far can you take that kind of stuff? So that's kind of the three-legged stool of this class. Monday is the last day. It's going to be at its current price. There'll be an open house then for students. February 4th, which is Wednesday, will be the first official session. And then up until the second session, people are free to do a late sign up, but it will be more expensive. So that's just a brief commercial. Really appreciate it. And then we're gonna continue having more talks on the lead up to the next AI powered search class, which will be at maven.com/search school. And there'll be other talks that are maybe not as like agentic or LLM focused, but still very exciting, interesting stuff with embedding search. There's some cool stuff happening now with improvements to late interaction models. There's all kinds of crazy, interesting, cool stuff happening in search. In fact, tomorrow, Charlie Hall will talk about using Cupid and Vespa, just straightforward offline evaluation. So yeah, that's my little commercial break. And I hope to see you in class. And with that, I will stop sharing and just you're it's totally up to you. If you it's more you're more than welcome to keep your camera on or off. Definitely if you're it's not a bad idea if you're participating. But yeah, let's get started. I wonder, Daniel, what you're seeing, and not just Daniel, I'm curious like if other people have thoughts on this, feel free to raise your hand. On agents and LLMs in your work these days.
Yeah, so given that I tend to work with search teams, I haven't seen any of them replaced by agents, right? I
Yeah.
think that,
I
and I think
apologize for my
that,
clickbait.
yeah, I think so. So let's like get that out of the way. That I mean, granted, I may not be, the agents aren't asking me for help, only search teams are, so there may be a bit of a selection bias. But I think that right now. It's clear why, for example, as an individual consumer, you might want an agentic search on your behalf. And it's clear how that comes up, say, in the context of coding, right? Like if you're looking for a module that does something, and what you would do normally would be to spawn off searches to GitHub, to PyPy, to some other libraries and so forth. And essentially, having something that automates what would have been a federation, a blending, that sort of thing makes a lot of sense. I think that people who are building commercial search applications, if nothing else, they don't even want to release that much control of the process. They may have incentives that aren't completely aligned with the end user ones. They also want a bit of consistency and determinism. So that they're just from I think from a business perspective, uh, there are issues to work out. But I also think that a big thing, like kind of the best case for agentic search, is very much what would happen if I were to outsource my search needs to a human agent. This idea that I can tell you
Hmm.
exactly what I want, that's easy for me to do that, that you have a decent amount of common sense and an infinite amount of willingness to do things. So you say, great, I know what I need, maybe ask a few questions in advance, but then I go off and do it and get back to you when I have it. And I think that there's a large class of search needs for which that's useful, but I think there's also a large class for which that isn't. And that the moment it's like, well, I won't know exactly what I want until I see some stuff along the way. At that point, agentic search today is iffy, right? This whole question of like, when does it know to ask for more feedback? When does it realize that some nuance in your needs would matter? And when does it realize that this process is likely to teach you something as a searcher that you wouldn't need otherwise? And even from a business perspective, a system that fails to do that is unlikely to close the sale.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. What's interesting, I think there are domains where there are like for agentic search, there are, and maybe I should step it back, take a step back and define kind of what we mean by this, because I think there's like for years, for at least years, for like since ChatGPT was a thing, basically late 2022, early 2023, we have built we RAG has been a thing. And I feel like RAG is kind of a like in some ways it's like a traditional search problem where you have like, an LLM interpret what a user wants, make a single shot of all that context into some query that might be structured and like results you as a hu as the API as the application go and get some results from a query backend and shove them into the LLM and show them the user and you have like one shot to figure all that out. In some ways that's like kind of in many ways like a traditional search problem. Like it's not much different than like search except you maybe have an LLM that can do like the cool thing is you have an LLM that can maybe help
It's better
structure.
snippets,
Yeah, and you get better snippets and
but
your
yeah.
LLM can like maybe show you the right stuff and ignore bad stuff. Where I think agents are interesting is that, well, a couple of things. First, they formalize that like interaction with the outside world with this tool usage notion. So an agent knows that it's interacting with the tool, even if like the plumbing of that is still you're in a for loop, you're taking a tool request and calling some search engine and then packaging it back up to the agent. It also has a reasoning loop. So that's the other interesting thing. Like if it gets something back that's weird, it maybe didn't use the search tool correctly, whatever's coming back isn't satisfying the user, it can do a degree of course correction within its like context. And so with that kind of thing, it's that's really that concept, it can be really powerful for certain kinds of domains where it's like there is a problem the user wants to solve. That's relatively complex and like the user can talk about it. I'm going to go off and autonomously gather candidates and give them to the user. Um, and where I think that's really interesting compared to the traditional RAG space, and I think e-commerce is probably most elucidating in this because there are cases in e-commerce that are just completely inappropriate for this. But there are cases where people search to have really complicated, uh, I would say information needs. And they probably like, if I just had an agent that literally was like sitting on the back end doing some work to help me find what I needed, that would be a huge advantage. Um, and so, for example, I could imagine like John Berryman has this vibe coded real estate search app that he likes to bring, like we do consulting together and he brings it to every consulting engagement, which I think is great. And it's really a great conversation piece for this agentic search space because that's a space with like really complicated needs. And you're like, I want a house that has, certain schools, certain neighborhoods, certain walkability. It's complicated. So it makes a lot of sense potentially for an agent to be involved in that. But then you have like another end of the spectrum, which is like this sort of like almost passive behavior that I might do on Amazon or eBay or something where I'm like, instant gratification. I want to just feel good about what I'm seeing. And retail therapy, that's maybe not an agentic thing. Or just be like literally the commodity kind of search of like, I don't know, buying toilet paper or buying like red shoes and seeing what's available. And I think that's interesting is like, and I don't know quite how to draw that line, but there is kind of like this is really important. I need to get this right. Human in the loop. expertise involved
Mhm.
versus casual instant gratification kind of thing that I still feel like current search and recommendations kind of thrives in.
Well, I'll ask Jeremy in a second, Tito in a second, but like, I would say, to me, a very big split point is how much do you know about the user's kind of ultimate need at the moment that they have expressed their search. Now, it might be that there's still a stage of converting what they said into something more sophisticated than just, retrieval and ranking based on conversion of that to something. It may be that, oh, actually, there are five different searches for different kinds of candidates. There may also be like, well, if I don't find something, here are my fallback options. So there may be sort of post result things. However, that's not based on new input from the searcher. That's based on either the like, sort of knowledge about how to translate what the searcher does into how to interact with the system, or learning, a script that you might do otherwise based contingency plans based on what the system does, but still knowing because you knew what the user needed how to do that. And I think these moments of truth, it's like, oh, I suddenly realize as a system that I need more. And that to me is a very big break point. Anyway, Tito, you had your hand raised.
Interesting.
Yeah, I just wanted to understand the scope of what we're talking about when we talk about agentic search here. Just building on the examples, Doug, that you shared, the e-commerce ones. So if I use an AI assistant that has been upgraded to include shopping use cases, and I tell it, I want this thing, right? I'm not specifying where I want it from. I don't, it's agentic in the sense that it's figuring out a lot of details. Do you consider that an agentic search, or are we talking more about instances where you might have some kind of recurring buying behavior or maybe a hard task and it's scouring for information in the background and then you either get a notification that it went ahead and found it, or you get a notification that it went ahead and bought it. I kind of understand like there is like a difference between like an autonomous agent where you give it instructions and it works in the background versus kind of what seems to be emerging right now, which is just a smarter search. But you have to like, it's a one-off, like, find me this thing. And I'm like waiting on it in some way. I'm trying to kind of understand like where you draw the line there.
I think it's a, I think they're both, I would consider both agentic search. What I think, but I think it's also a amorphously fast evolving, poorly defined space. Uh, uh, so in the former case of like, I am just using like ChatGPT's shopping function. Um, in some ways that can be, I've used that. In some ways it can be really useful, but it's really useful in the sense of like, it's good at like, because it's chatty, it's just getting a lot more information out of me than like I would from a normal search bar. And there is something about that experience that is much more, even in that experience, that is, I feel like in some ways closer to the old quote unquote experience of going to Google and like looking for the Wirecutter article and like what the best headphones I should get, or it's almost like kind of in that early, sometimes I'm not using it to like, I'm usually not using it for fun things. I'm using it because like there's a problem to solve where it's like I care about like I care about some specific aspect. I want to do research. I want to know what headphones I should get for my teenager that are going to be durable and have some is basically like not going to destroy them and has low likelihood of destroying them and so on. And I'm like giving it this information, and I feel like sometimes that's like it's not quite at the stage where I'm like either making impulse buys at the end of the funnel or it's like I know exactly what I need. So do you think that's like a differentiation um, that we could talk about? I also think there is a kind of agentic search as a long running like it's kind of come up more like coding agents, like autonomous agents, and it's maybe crazy. I think it's maybe towards the bleeding edge of the vibe coding thing, but these autonomous agents that sit in the background and do stuff. I guess like in some ways for search, there is kind of a pattern that I've seen in some domains where it's like there is a, let's say the web, or there is some like larger data set where I have an agent that's like kind of collecting candidates from that data set, but that they get manifest in some local store for me personally. Um, that's almost more like a crawler, but it's almost like an agentic kind of crawler where it's like preparing, like you could imagine going out to having an agent that was really good at like had access to Indeed search and LinkedIn search and all of these
That's
candidate
exactly where I was
search.
going to go with this, by the way.
Yeah, it's like and this is actually an example I have in my course. It's like prepare me, give me the 500 top experts in, I don't know, agentic search. And somehow it can do that. And but it's prepared for you almost like a mini search index that's local for you to explore and maybe even like get some breakdown or top level breakdown. So
That
I think both are valid. Yeah.
sounds like a personally tailored um, in this example, e-commerce experience, except, instead of the drudge work of having to source all of these things, presumably it's has done all that work and then brought it back to you and presented it in the fashion that is ideal for your decisioning, your conversion.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
almost um, uh, like a fresh baked federated e-commerce page or something like that.
Yeah.
So I think what's
Yeah.
funny in this model, right? I think the hiring or candidate or expert search is great. Neat. Imagine that you did this and this tool is like, great, I'll get back to you in a day or in 15 minutes, or but like in an amount of time that doesn't quite feel interactive. And then it comes back and it gives you a whole bunch of SEO experts say, and it's like, that's not what I meant. And if you have to do this repeatedly, you start to feel potentially that I can tell it, and I hope it understood me, and I'll find out in 15 minutes if it really did. And in contrast, I think a lot of us have gotten used to, okay, search isn't that smart, but the feedback is pretty quick. So it still puts a lot of burden on us to refine, to revise, but at least the speed of the feedback allows us to essentially keep making attempts. And in some ideal world, the communication channel is one where it's like, look, understanding isn't perfect, but it's certainly better than just, here's a bunch of retrieved and ranked results by some opaque function. And the communication is at a level where, it's a bit more effort than what we're used to with our keyword searches, but we feel like that effort's rewarded because we're able to hone in on what we want. I feel like it kind of agentic search is pushing us in that direction. Now, to be fair, some things take a lot of work. So I think use the sort of recruiting as the example. If you've ever worked with an outside recruiter, the good ones take a bunch of time, show you examples, essentially converge on, okay, we agree on what your information need is. Now I know what I need. I can work in the background. I can work with slow
Yeah.
latency. And I
Yeah.
think that pattern is one, at least I haven't seen that emerge in the agentic space yet. But there's no reason we couldn't do it.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of this stuff is being designed as we're talking about. I mean, we're literally designing systems as we're speaking right now, but so I do wonder like how this will look for I see I bring this up because this question comes up in almost every discussion I have with a team where there is I would say like a highly, a very thoughtful information need user with a very usually strongly incentivized to care about the outcome. So usually that's people who are like doing this as their job. So like people work with a certain kind of financial or legal or medical data, uh, and or the people who are like, e-commerce user that are very incentivized to care about their purchase. Maybe that's a good way. That might be a good way to think about it, is like how how thoughtful are you about your information need versus like where I am more skeptical is we have spilt over the last 10, 20 years, all of these systems that are in some ways built around like clickstream data on like because thousands of people a day search for red shoes, and we know what's is gratifying for those red shoes users and drives engagement. Uh, and it's because, these shoes look a certain way, or we have a certain way of like, people's lizard brains clicking on things. I don't think that lizard brain side of the information retrieval space, which is kind of like that kind of passive search, and I don't want to like say it's demean it as like it's not complicated. It's just like maybe lacks human beings often are lacking consciousness of their information need or lacking prioritization of it. Uh, over to like that kind of search over to things like recommender systems, which I don't think necessarily, I feel like that's still a thing that's like, I just want to see on a beautiful pane of glass, this sort of like a set of products that I might get excited about, or, oh, this, I haven't heard of this book and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Jer?
so Jeremy raised an interesting point in the chat, right? Like that we're talking essentially about these traditional alerts or standing filters. I've seen different named listeners, and I do think that the um, the idea of those, which I was also thinking of even before I saw him posted in the chat, has been around for a very long time. But um, the what these things are able to do, or rather that the implementation details, if you will, but such as the expressivity of what you're watching out for is a very big difference. And that's it's the same, you could argue in the search itself. It's like if I'm able to essentially after a conversation say, okay, now we figured out exactly what I want. Now, if you can get it from me immediately, that's great. But if it's going to take time, we've just de-risked the you're going to get me stuff. I'll have to wait for it, and it'll turn out that it's not what I want. But if you go back far enough, there was a time when the search would cost you. But I mean, it costs you in time, even if it doesn't cost you in money. It costs you in kind of the opportunity cost if you trust this thing is going to give you stuff for it and you don't do that in that time. So I think, the trade-off is basically, do I want a very rapid feedback loop because I don't trust you to know and be able to get me what I want? Or do I want to say, look, that part's been de-risked. So now I'm actually just, I mean, sure, sooner is better, but quality is really the most important thing. So take the time that you need. And, if new stuff comes in, assuming it's a dynamic system, get me that stuff as it's available. I do think, by the way, like this agentic idea goes well beyond search. I mean, if you're using vibe coding, it's the difference between, sort of Claude telling you, yeah, I know what you mean. It's like, no, 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 you don't. And please, like, ask me more questions before jumping to the conclusion that, I don't want to be bothered. It's true, I'm using an agent because I don't want to do the work, but that doesn't mean that I want the wrong work done for me.
Right. Yeah, I noticed like Daniel, one thing that you you were that I would be curious to get your perspective on is like this sort of like compounding errors that tend to happen with these agents. If you have like it's really cool that an agent is autonomous and maybe it could go away even and come back tomorrow with like job candidates or houses to buy or whatever. But what happens when something compounds? And we sort of, like you hinted at this, we sort of see this with coding agents. Like
Yeah.
coding agents can go completely off in left field, and if you are not paying attention, things can go wrong.
I mean, we see it even, we don't have to go to agents to see where this starts to happen in search. I've seen people who they fixate on their scoring function when the real issue is that their query understanding is broken. And so, not surprisingly, improving the function that relates your queries to your results is not going to give you much if fundamentally the problems in your queries, or maybe the representation of your content itself. In a sense, agentic search just doubles down on this problem. If the way in which your need has been understood is problematic, um, you now have a system that's going to go all out to meet that. Even worse, if somewhere along the way it learns things that are wrong and doubles down, it just keeps going from there. So, um, the, you know, if you're in the loop and you're in the loop frequently, as a human, you're likely to notice that something's up, intervene and break that. So I think a big challenge is for these systems to have enough self-awareness to say, there's enough of a chance that I might have gotten something wrong, or enough of a risk that I might have gotten something wrong to ask for more, or ask for clarification, or even ask for confirmation. Now, the downside is if these things do it all the time, you'll say, stupid agent, why am I even, why don't I just do it all myself if I'm going to have to intervene at every stage? Managing that trade-off, I do think, is the fundamental problem of agentic workflows in general, but agentic search in particular.
Yeah, 100%. And it seems like the way people are dealing with that is they just like kind of mirroring the coding space is you really have to have a lot of guardrails along the way. And I think one of the things that our job, if we're building this kind of workflow, is like, what are the checkpoints along? Are there basically, you can think about them as assertions or logical tests of the universe that you can add along the way that help you ensure that the data that you're retrieving is in some ways like sane. And there's levels of this, right? One thing you're probably not going to be able to solve is if the user like typed in a stupid question and the agent like crazily interpreted it. Although now that I say that, I think like one thing that you can do there is just add guardrails of like, am I reading way too much into this compared to like what was actually specified? Am
The
I?
stupid question is a really good example where we learned early on, if I think you might have misspelled something, I clarify that rather
Yeah,
than going all in and saying, "Oh, I'm sure you meant exactly what you said." If there is enough ambiguity in the query, or just if I'm not sure I understood it, the like an example I use in the speech context is that Newark sounds a lot like New York. And if I ask
totally.
for a flight to Newark, maybe you should say just let's confirm before I start spending a lot of effort booking you, or at least looking for flights to the wrong airport. So that's not even a case of the query not making sense, and potentially not even a case of the system mishearing or misunderstanding the query. It's just saying, wow, there's enough of a probability of getting this wrong. And if I got it wrong, um, the cost will be high. The cost, on the other hand, of clarifying is very low.
Yeah, I think that's like actually a big difference between what it feels like as developers when we are building like vibe coding an application versus as developers what it feels like when we're building an agentic system for someone else.
Mhm.
So if we're like vibe coding an application, we see the agent go off on the rails in its code generation. We add whatever checks that we think we need to monitor the situation, tests, like whatever that kind of give it a sense of its what direction it should go. Um, but if we're building a tool for someone else, that almost like that's like a 10x increase in complexity because we have to take all of these situations. And I mean, it gets to a classic problem of search of we have to be able to test all of these situations that are ambiguous, weird, off on the rails situations. And we have to ask ourselves, uh, we have to begin to basically do a level of query understanding evaluation. Like, are we understanding these chat terms in an accurate way? And you have the added complexity, which Jeremy kind of points out, of like, you have a LLM that has its own mind about things which may or may not be in line, which often is like 80% in line with what the user domain is. And those things have to be reconciled because the LLM will make assumptions about like when you ask a certain kind of question, then I try to think of a good example of this. Uh, maybe a classic example just comes from like the query understanding world of like I think I actually used this a couple days ago when I talked about search evaluation. I did some work for a major US auto parts supplier, and it was their internal search. It was like the salespeople would go and search for things. And my default assumption, and I'm pretty sure this would be an LLM's default assumption, was like when the user searches for like a given part number or part type or part number, they just want that part to come back. In reality, what they're doing is they're looking for what commission can I get? Like, what are the advertised commissions on parts today? And does this one have a commission or does this one have a commission? And so that completely changes how you might interpret the query and how you might evaluate the query and the query understanding. And you can't just like 80% of the time the LLM will do the right thing with its encyclopedic knowledge, and that's the secret weapon. But 20% of the time, it sort of reveals the assumptions even you have about the domain and how you often assume when you work on a search team everyone thinks this way, but then you suddenly realize like, oh wait, no, the world has to be taught about my assumptions.
Well, I mean, I think this goes back to this old concept of query performance prediction, right? Like you look at your answer. Does your answer look completely unreasonable because you're effectively talking about five different things, and somebody who's interested in one of them wouldn't be interested in the other four? Then you're like, okay, well, maybe I need to clarify, but I know, right? Like if that's a set of search results and they're incoherent, generally a sign that I must have broken somewhere along the way, and the obvious
Yeah.
place would be in misunderstanding the question. I have priors, and if I arrive at a question and have a model that says that's a really weird question, maybe in some domains that's okay, especially if there is no sort of strong head of the distribution. But it's a bit of feedback to say, given that my prior on somebody asking a question like this is so low, maybe I should see if it's more likely that I misunderstood and they meant something more probable. So all of those techniques that we've had in not just query understanding, but in general, the end-to-end evaluation of how a system is performing still matter. And for that matter, the new techniques like sort of chain of thought or other kind of verification techniques, they fit into this. They're ways of saying,
Mhm.
does it look like I got to a reasonable end from where I started? And I think that the more complex the pathway, the more critical it is to building guardrails like that.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. And I think we're discovering what those guardrails are and should be too. Like another kind of guardrails, if you do have this long running task that is going off and building a small index of candidates for you, uh, then you need the guardrails of knowing your index is sanely constructed and that like anyone who's going to use that down the stream is going to be able to use it in a way that makes sense. I think what's interesting is, there is people may know there's a company called Hornet.dev, which is maybe people know Joe Christian Bergam, who used to work at Vespa. Their whole thing is agentic search. And I think that's a lot of what to me makes them interesting is like what their platform is really about is like thinking through all of these constraints that we would have and sort of guardrails. I have no like commercial connection to them, but I think it's interesting just from a uh, how they think about like guardrails around like doing anything from sort of like syntactically forming a sane collection up into you know potentially like relevance itself being a kind of guardrail that you're sort of like looking out for.
I like to just point about per, basically having client side, well, not necessarily client side implementation, but this idea that agents are a natural place for personalization. And I mean, I think of that as um, similar to this idea of like learning to rewrite. Like if I'm looking for shirts, obviously, if I don't say anything else, I mean t-shirts because me, right? But the
Uh-huh.
and um, whether it's source selection, whether it's location, all sorts of contexts. I think that um, the nice thing is that an agent, can appropriately, sort of try to overfit to the searcher, but also can be transparent about it, can say what it's learned, so that I mean, I had this funny experience with ChatGPT where it assumed that everything I cared about was in the context of my being, a high class consultant, to the point where it started suggesting when I asked about restaurants that there would be places I'd be taking clients. I'm like, no, no, like, please, like, stop doing that, right? But so,
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, personalization always has its risks that way. But I think in the context of an agent that you can teach, you can give feedback to, there's an opportunity for a huge amount of leverage. And I do like that.
yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, I think I've had similar experiences with memory. I think memory is kind of a difficult, I feel like it's not quite a fully formed feature yet because people have all kinds of weird experiences where it seems to selectively remember weird things from previous conversations. Um, like that. I think at one point I gave it some like argument and I said, act like a college professor critiquing their grad student, like to try to break it out of sycophantic mode. Uh, and then like for a week or so after, that was like all I got. It was like the college professor tone, like even if I had some like casual question about everything, which was funny.
Yeah, you've all raised the point about conflicts of interest, potentially, or at least competition of interest between, uh, you know, uh, consumer searchers and say the people who are running e-commerce sites. I think it raises a bigger question, which is basically in a world where the immediate searchers aren't people, then a lot of things do break down, right? This is why Amazon is so upset at Perplexity, because suddenly their ability to throw ads all over the place, or manipulate the ranking in some ways, completely undermined by the system that's basically able to read through them, toss out the stuff that's not of interest to the user. And I do think that if you go down that path, ultimately, you're going to see very different incentive systems. You might even see something imagined decades ago where search has to be paid because you're effectively,
Mm,
right now, the reason why search can be free is not just ads, but in general that, search explicitly commands human attention, and that attention is either monetized by the interaction with the results directly or
hmm.
with some kind of payment for it. But if most of the attention now will be done by machines whose attention cannot be monetized directly, with the economic model does have to change.
Yeah, you see this. I mean, it's another parallel with code. You see this with open source maintainers who are like, it used to be the case that human beings would come to GitHub, they would see this project I made, they would participate, they might see products related to this product, to this open source project in like the documentation. And a lot of that has just gone off a cliff. Like people are like, should I make this completely private? Like people think about these kinds of things. Like uh although in code it's even starker because like potentially the LLMs have all like memorized your code anyway, unfortunately, for better or for worse. Um so I think you're right. Like I think that we could see a situation and you see this web search has become a market even because of how of agents. Like there are companies like Exa that their whole thing is we charge for you to have a web index so that you can search over, so your agents can search over. So you already see it with that. And I will be interested to know to what extent this develops in other domains. I mean, Reddit holds, I mean, it's tightly related to holding your data closely because Reddit also kind of enters these monetization agreements with people about their content. That's a bit more for training. But I do see it on search. Like some agents are like, I've run out of my usage limit on searching Reddit or something. Uh, so I think you're absolutely right. I feel like in some ways, there's the dead internet theory of like everything will be generated by LLMs. but also there's the like potentially increasingly private internet theory of like all the humans will be hiding in some kind of, I don't know, walled garden somewhere or some place that at least has like limited access for like things that used to be just like people were happy for them to be crawled by Google. They're just not at all happy for like ChatGPT, OpenAI to crawl them.
I I mean, doubling down on what Mary's saying, that like we certainly saw like Stack Overflow is a lot less interesting now that, people instead of looking and maybe having some moment of gratitude or attention to the people posting there are getting the same kinds of answers, through their LLMs. And I mean, you could generalize that to saying, right now, you look for an open source package, then you use something like Claude, and it installs the open source package without even you're having to know about it. So you certainly don't feel anything towards the maintainers. To it builds something from scratch that is based on the open source package. So right, and over time, whatever the currency that this kind of volunteer work might have represented reputationally, or what have you, it diminishes. Now, does that mean that humans suddenly become much more mercenary? Does it
Hmm.
potentially mean that also we say, look, it's nice that you published a book of the tables of logarithms, but we don't really need people to do that anymore because
Hmm.
it's computable, right? And so
Hmm.
I think it does become an interesting question as to um, how much of this work was never inherently human to begin with, and the
Hmm.
machines can do it because they're effectively they're just doing grunt work themselves, which is quite, I
Hmm.
think, different from just piggybacking on the inherently, what we think of today at least, is the inherently human work of creation.
Yeah, we especially like some of these like research is an interesting space with that because I feel like you might, on the one hand, you might say doing this complicated research in a search tool and being able to use that and critically think about each result. On the one hand, you might argue, that's important human work. On the other hand, the other end of the spectrum of having an agent give you information and breadcrumbs, and then you have to think critically about at least the summary it gave you. Because agents, like doing research through, I don't know if anyone's done actual serious research with ChatGPT, like try to actually, like, I think a lot of people do casual research and get uh, their priors reinforced, so to speak. Their like sort of existing assumptions reinforced. Because this is why I told ChatGPT to treat me like a college, a student, and it be the professor. Uh, because there is a degree to which if you are a user of one of these potentially agentic search applications, it's not so much that it may ultimately be a value add in terms of time save of like laboriously going through and reading everything. On the other hand, you have to be savvy. It's a skill in and of itself because LLMs have very specific limitations in terms of wanting, if you ask it a question, if you frame that as a thing that it can confirm, it is going to do that. If you frame it as, so if you're more careful about framing it, uh, you may get more results. You may get better results, but you have to be really careful because it can easily just want to find evidence for confirming your initial hypothesis. Uh, so I think there is a kind of research skill and critical thinking skill that's basically, in some ways, more needed today for everybody than like a couple years ago, pre-ChatGPT. It's just that a researcher's job may not be as much to go and like potentially read everything that comes back in a search results page.
Look, I think one of the interesting things that these tools are doing. I mean, I'll go on a tangent, but it'll make sense in a moment. I remember early on in the sort of data science, machine learning days, you had to learn both how to use all the technical tools And you have to learn something about statistics. You have to learn kind of fundamentals of, say, machine learning, the concepts like overfitting, et cetera. And you tended to learn both of these things, and maybe you thought of that as one big bag of skills. And then suddenly the technology is democratized. All you need to do is use an API by downloading some Python package, for example, and you didn't need to know anything about the infrastructure and so forth. And the problem was not that learning about the infrastructure was so important. The problem was that the people who didn't know about the infrastructure also didn't know about statistics, about sort of the philosophy and theory of
Yeah.
machine learning. And so they
Yeah.
would misuse these tools. And now I think we're finding that, let's say you're seeing this with coding, like can every uh, can non-coders code now that they can use Claude? Not necessarily, because it turns out that concepts like testing, concepts like technical debt, concepts like um, generalizability of solutions and scope, whatever, these things matter. So I think that the biggest danger I see in the technology of search getting too easy is that um, we're no it, we're masking the importance of critical thinking. We're masking, like um, these problems always existed. The example, for example, of uh, being looking for confirmatory evidence only, we see that in A/B testing. But hopefully, at a time when anybody running A/B tests also had to learn about all things they could do wrong, maybe they'd be less prone to do this. But if anybody can push a button and do it, they don't find out, oh, what are the terms and conditions under which you can do that. And I think that we really have to rethink what what it means to leverage this ecosystem. And it's happened. The change is happening
Yeah.
so radically.
Yeah, totally. I have it, and it's such a we might be a bit far afield from agentic search, but still, I think it's interesting because in an education context, if you it's a sort of a eggshell thing to walk across. Because on the one hand, I'd like to go and I have a teenager, and what's interesting is like how much they've brought back in the school, just like in class essays and like they compared to when I was probably when we were teenagers, Daniel, they're like the teachers are like, I actually kind of like your kids' writing quirks, and they're not as persnickety about like things that a spell checker or grammar checker would catch, which is in some ways kind of refreshing. They
Mhm.
want the non-GPT experience as much as possible. Uh, but on the other hand, I feel like there is a there is like a right there is a time that older kids, college students, it's like I almost want to like give people a course that's just like, I want you to research this really complicated topic and you can use anything you want, but you have to be able to like verbally adversarially defend what you're using and take advantage of the fact that like ChatGPT, like let them use ChatGPT or whatever, but take advantage of the fact that like ChatGPT is going to, feed them a load of BS of things that they want to hear. Uh, I think that would be a lot of fun.
Yeah. I mean, look, I've been it's agentic search of a sort. It's a side project I've been playing around with generating karaoke videos. And
Oh
what's
yeah,
interesting is that uh, so you give a song name, title, what have you. Which one? It's on YouTube. Which one? It's in lyrics databases. Which ones? Do they align? Right? And it turns out that if you're naive about this, it seems like a really simple problem. Like grab these things, put them together. And then you discover their discrepancies. And then you discover you
right.
could maybe try to extract the audio yourself. But then, like, what you treat as source of truth. And it turns out that if you're not careful and you use, kind of an agentic coding tool, it will do everything for you, not be happy with it, and then when you try to make a fix, it will do what your worst self would do, which is just hack something that kind of fixes that. So you have to step back and say, wait, like, let me understand the problem I'm trying to solve. Now, it doesn't mean that you should then be not get the benefits
Right.
of
Yeah.
of what these tools can automate for you. I don't think you should have to learn the APIs to every system that you're using. That's a great case for having that be translated for you. I don't think you should have to, find every relevant tool with, with your bare hands. That's a great, sort of a casual research use case. But understanding where, you still need to be involved in the decision making, uh, versus where you should be outsourcing that. Like that that's sort of the agentic problem in general. And in the case of search, at least we have this. The nice thing is it's in the context of you're having an actual need to find stuff or to find information.
Right. Right. I think Tito makes a really good point about a lot of people, like human beings, will sort of by default trust what the search says. And this happens all the time with there in fact, so my son and I play this game called Axis and Allies, which is just like a World War II strategy game. And we frequently use
Hopefully.
chat. Do you play that?
No, no, I said hopefully.
Hopefully. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes. Hopefully scope to World War II. Uh, and yeah, so the we will look up rules with ChatGPT, and like 9 times out of 10, it's right when we confirm them. But there was one thing we realized, sort of like when you add up the amount of sort of like every square on the board gets a player a certain amount of money, basically. It's like when you add that up, it's different than the like starting amount that it says on the like in the rule book or whatever. And we had this like long discussion about with ChatGPT. It's like, no, this is different. We've added it up multiple times. We have to figure out like what's going on here. And lo and behold, luckily, like through honestly through Googling more than ChatGPT, we're like we found the like forum post on the company website that's like, oh yeah, that's like off by one for every player, and here's what tournament players do, and here's what other people do. So it was like, I thought that was like really educational for both for him. I mean, but for both of us of like, yeah, getting like the basic facts of this game, it was pretty good at like kind of so we didn't have to like, when you play these complicated board games, you have to go through these instruction manuals and they're a headache. But then like the sort of like these sort of like weird edge case things that like not everyone's going to notice. It definitely you definitely still have to have your researcher brain.
Yeah. And I think like we were talking about trust, and Mary just mentioned it. Yeah, like that. I mean, on one hand, there's an opportunity here for these systems to say like, um, here's my evidence, here's why you should trust this, and so forth. I mean, one of the questions will be when to do that and to what extent. I mean,
Mhm.
uh, if the if the stakes are low, just give me an answer and I'll run with it. If the stakes are high, um, it's worth slowing it down. And so having, um, and I think realistically, I mean, you could imagine that you as a user say, look, this is really important to me, so get this right. And some cases you might have to do that because it might not be obvious that it would be important. But I think these systems should have decent priors. Just that like if you're making a very expensive purchase, presumably the systems should know, wow, like if I steer you wrong, that's going to be a big deal. And if you're doing something that's very like, I'll give the example if I want to play a song and you play the wrong song, what's the big deal? I just hit next. If I'm going to send an email and you send it to the wrong person, that's a big enough deal. You should check. Hey, did you really mean that? Is that the person you intended to? And this idea of sensitivity of an error model that reflects that is something that I don't see these systems investing enough effort into.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. We got a couple minutes left. Daniel, I didn't actually give you a chance to introduce yourself, which I am sorry about that, but do you want to give a little spiel just about yourself and where people can find you?
Sure. So I've been working in search pretty much since forever as part of the founding team of Endeca in 1999, which basically brought faceted search to e-commerce sites. Worked at Google and LinkedIn for a while, and then about 6 years ago, I went on my own and have been helping mostly e-commerce companies, but also other folks on bringing sort of better search to people. And I think I'd say I used to be contrarian in that I was less focused on ranking and much more focused on really getting to query understanding, to getting to kind of negotiating the searcher's intent. What's funny is it feels like the world has come around a bit, and now that's much more aligned with what folks are doing. And I'm sure that Jeremy is smiling on or off camera because we've been on that journey together.
Cool. All right. Well, I hope definitely check out Daniel's stuff. Check out the Agentic Search course if it interests you. But thank you everyone for coming. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope everyone has a good Thursday and rest of your weekend. Take care.
Thank you all.